our next panel has been organised jointly by several members of the coordination group, specifically OVAM, IUCN, INEC, EMF, CETRA and GCE, all working together on the cross-cutting issues of the circular economy, namely biodiversity and climate. So we're going to focus on the transformative solutions that might be there to tackle the root causes of these challenges on a global level. This climate change, as we've said over and over again, as well as biodiversity loss, are huge problems for the future and ones that need to be tackled when we think about the circular economy. So we're going to hand over to moderate this session. I'm delighted to welcome Emma Saarinen from CETRA, the Finnish Innovation Fund, to take over the reins of this and talk you through it over the next 45 minutes. So Emma, I'm going to pass the floor to you, and I'm sure you'll have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Dear listeners and speakers, welcome to this session on climate and biodiversity. My name is Emma Saarinen, and I work with circular economy and biodiversity at the Finnish Innovation Fund, CETRA, and represent Finnish youth in the negotiation under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Building on the discussion held yesterday on making the opportunities of circular economy in climate and energy targets visible, this session will focus on circular economy as a transformative solution to tackle the root causes of climate change and biodiversity loss. As highlighted yesterday, to future-proof our climate strategies, we need to prioritize actions that support both emission reductions and biodiversity. In these sessions, members of the coordination group will showcase circular actions already taken and share their current understanding and views on how to better integrate circular economy strategies and measures into climate and biodiversity policies. In this session, we will hear 2 keynotes, and you will have a chance to ask questions after the presenters are finished. So please do use the chat for questions. Besides our keynote speakers, also coordination group members from OVAM, CETRA, IUCN, Generation Climate Europe, and INEC will be online to provide answers. Yesterday, we heard that even though many countries mention circular economy in their climate strategies, only a few have been able to quantify the impact of circular solutions on greenhouse gas emissions. This is what Luc Allarts will explore in our first keynote. Luc is the manager of Circular Economy Policy Centre, an academic consortium funded by the Flemish government that builds the knowledge base for the circular economy transition in Flanders. His research expertise comprises the development of indicators and data for monitoring circularity at different scales. He is a senior researcher at Catholic University of Leuven and member of the private-public partnership Circular Flanders. Welcome, Luc. The floor is yours.
Just a reminder to our speakers, you must press the speak button to gain access to the microphone, and the red light means that you're on air.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sharing my screen for you. So good afternoon all. I'm very happy to present you a few insights on the link between circular economy and climate. And these insights come from our research performed in the Circular Economy Center in Flanders, which was already kindly introduced before. So we are directly funded by the Flemish administration. We receive about €500,000 per year, and we employ about 6 researchers, and there is a group of about 15 professors involved with this research. What we are doing is, based on academic work, we are building up a knowledge base for policy towards the Flemish government, the Flemish administration. So we are actually not policymakers ourselves. We are researchers, but we have direct interactions with the policymakers involved in the CE transition, which is of course quite a wide group. What we do deliver are policy reports, elaborated case studies.
Luke, it's Jennifer here from the technical moderating side in the room. I wonder if you could just put your mic a little bit closer to your mouth. We're having some difficulty picking up what you're saying.
Is this better?
It's better. And speak loudly, I think.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for interrupting for that. So last year, at the end of last year, we published an online CE monitor for Flanders that shows the progress of the circular economy in our region. We have also been developing indicators. So based on this background, I will now share you a few insights, and the first one comes effectively from this CE monitor, which I will shortly introduce to you. It's a quite extended product. It contains about 140 indicators. Quite a lot of them are macro indicators that summarize the situation for Flanders, but we also have a whole series of more detailed
Luke, apologies for interrupting again. Perhaps we could try just using the mic on your laptop rather than the headset. We're struggling to make it out clearly.
Okay, so you want me to disconnect then?
Disconnect that, and we'll see if your laptop can do the job instead. You'll have to press the speak button again, Luke. Apologies, I know it's a bit tricky to get all of these things working simultaneously.
Okay,
The sound is a lot better now. Yes, thank you very much.
That's great. We hope to be back to live meetings soon in future, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, just continuing. Why did we gather so much indicators? The reason is, in our vision circular economy, the economy in itself is a system that fulfills our needs. And eventually that's being done by producing and consuming products. And if we are going to make a transition towards the circular economy, that means that these products will change products that we are producing, that we're consuming, also the composition of these products and the ways in which we use these products. So that's then referring to the services associated with the products. So if we can capture scores at the product group level, we should be able to grasp the circular economy transition much sooner compared to the macro indicators who tends to evolve only very slowly. We have been collecting data on product groups. We have been aggregating them in systems like mobility, housing, nutrition, and some other ones to make the link with the more high-level numbers. On top of this, the monitor also comprises a material flow scheme for Flanders, which is essentially a mass base showing all the mass flows. And at the different nodes in this scheme, I guess these schemes are quite familiar to people working with CE data. At the nodes in this scheme, you can find the familiar indicators like the DMC and RMC and so on. For instance, a cyclical material use rate has been calculated for Flanders. It's 21% and strongly increased over the last few years. Then in this scheme, then to make the link with climate, because this was the topic of the speech, we have to zoom to the emission parts. And part of these emissions are due to the burning of fossil fuels. And then actually there is two kinds of indicators that you can use here. One is the territorial emissions and the other one is the footprint emissions. And actually we tried to display them next to each other in our monitor. In fact, we see circular economy as a means to reach broader sustainability goals. And so we display, on the one hand, circularity with flows of material going into the system, flows of material and waste going out of the system, and then the closing of the cycles with our strategies. From this vision, territorial emissions can be seen as a direct waste stream. It's actually material that's being wasted in the gas phase. Then looking to the broader effects, every product that we are consuming or producing has had quite some steps already in other countries, starting from the mining of the materials until the waste stage. So there is always a carbon footprint associated, comprising also the emissions outside the borders of the own region. So we display carbon footprint as a broader effect, a less direct effect of our transition. Looking to the numbers in Flanders, we come to conclusions that I think that will probably hold as well for quite a lot of countries in Europe. The values of both territorial and footprint emissions are quite high, although there might be a few decreases over the past years, but they are stagnating at a high level and they are far from what we would have to reach to have a sustainable share. And for sure, they are much higher than the targets towards 2050. In fact, we also have these data for each of the different systems like nutrition, housing, and mobility. And that also provides some further insights in what's the most important points in these emissions. But instead of showing that, I have to make the remark here that actually it's not possible for the moment to make a more direct connection between circular economy and climate. So if I said before that the cyclical material use rate is 21%, it's not possible for me to make any conclusion like what's the amount of avoided emissions because of this cyclical material use rate. The best thing that can be reached today is to make a further analysis of territorial emission data. That has been done in a recent study by the Waste Agency in Flanders. And by adding up all the emissions coming from the productions of goods and fuels, transportation of goods, food production and storage, and waste disposal, if you add it up all, you can have a conclusion that about 2/3 of the emissions can be directly brought back to us dealing with materials. But there is another way of considering the climate, the relation between climate and circular economy, and that's by developing scenarios. And that we did many times in our research in the Policy Research Center. So we have been elaborating scenarios, or rather we tried to model what would be the effect of a certain circularity strategy if we really focus on that in the future. To give a first example, in mobility, okay, we know we have the overall emission targets, and in Flanders we have a local policy plan that calculated it through, and the conclusion of the plan is we need to reduce the emissions of person mobility by about 50%. And there is different ways to do that, different scenarios. In orange, you can see the scenario in which we say we go for a full replacement for full introduction of electrical vehicles on the market by 2030. And then you can see in the graph on top, in terms of territorial emissions, we are not getting to a reduction of 50%, it's only 30%. And in terms of footprint emissions at the bottom, the result is even worse. We could also go for an extreme scenario that we say we reduce the amount of kilometers we drive, and logically you reach the climate goal in that case. But yeah, you have a serious limitation in possibilities of everyone. And then third, we calculated a circular scenario that we said we keep the amount of person kilometers stable. We focus on much more intensive and efficient use of cars. And in this way, it should be possible to make the same amount of person kilometers with much less vehicles. And so we reach also the climate target by 2030. And in terms of footprint in green at the bottom, you see that the reduction is even lower. How can we better understand this? The next slide shows a bit more details on the footprint data. The reference situation is shown at the left. In the middle is the situation that we introduce electrical cars in an accelerated way. And here you can see that the part in yellow, the production part of the emissions, is still very high. And that's because the production burden of electrical vehicles is higher than that of conventional vehicles. At the right, you can see the circular scenario with a lot of sharing and pooling of cars. And there you can see you can serve the same mobility demand with a much smaller stock of vehicles. And of course, you then also need to produce much less cars, and that translates in less emissions. In another example, we did a similar reasonings for housing. And here we know, of course, we need to insulate all the houses we have up to the level that they are not emitting emissions anymore. if you would start doing that in a territorial sense, you would immediately reduce the emissions, but you also have to consider the materials you need for that, the insulation materials. You need to produce them, to transport them, to install them, and that also causes considerable emissions. And if we add up all these emissions, our conclusion in the calculations is that it will take 4 years until at the overall level, the emissions will start to decrease. There will be an overshoot initially. So that's something very important to consider here. We also elaborated a few scenarios here. I'm quickly showing this. The graph at the right shows the carbon footprint up to the year 2050. Which it's a cumulative curve, so logically it increases. Green is the business as usual situation, and the red curve, which is 20% below the green one, that's a scenario where we say we will carefully see which materials we use to build new houses, like using wood, for instance, and we will also go for a very high recycling and reuse of building and demolition waste, and so we can capture or compensate for part of these emissions. Then the Waste Agency published a study on circular strategies for textile, and here there are very interesting conclusions about the different kinds of emissions. For instance, the third scenario here focuses on local processing of textile, and that leads to even an increased amount of territorial emissions, while there is a lot of reduction if you look to the footprint emissions. In the end, of course, all these strategies are quite extreme. We need to add them up, they need to interact, and that's what's also been shown in the study by making a combination of all the strategies, and then you come to a more balanced view of how to consider the emissions. So then I came to the end of my slides. In my conclusion, I may be a bit stating the evident, but yeah, the thing is, materials come with emissions throughout all the steps in their life cycle, from the mining till the waste stage. Circular economy is about materials, so you can be sure that both territorial and footprint emissions will be affected. But the point is, there is no generalized way to see how this will turn out. You have to actually consider case by case, product group per product group, to see what's happening with territorial emissions, what's happening with footprint emissions, are there win-wins, are there trade-offs? It needs to be studied in detail from a system perspective. And if we manage to do that, well, then we can make sure that that circular economy is really also contributing to climate. And on the other hand, it can also be an interesting perspective from climate to not only focus on the territorial emissions, but also be open towards footprint emissions, which can maybe in some cases lead to even higher benefits.
Thank you, Luke. This has been super interesting, but I think we need to wrap up now to have time for audience questions as well.
Yes.
I think this was really fascinating. You're doing amazing work with the monitoring, and as this is a climate and biodiversity session, I would have a question, Luke, for you to begin. And the question would be that in the future, could the monitor be complemented with additional indicators regarding biodiversity as well, and maybe also extended to a wider geographical scope? Can we get Luke back on stage to answer the question?
Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So the monitor is built up as a kind of growth model. So we have a version 1.0 online with all the available data, but it's ready to elaborate, to expand, to further develop. For instance, at the side of the broader effects, we have been focusing especially on climate for quite evident reasons, but it should be possible to include indicators on other effects, like, for instance, biodiversity, but it could also be pollution. Land use is also a very relevant one that will need to be explored, like in which directions do we want to invest, and what about the data availability or the efforts to get these data. About using the monitor at other geographical scales, Well, it's developed for Flanders, but it could be evenly applied at the national level and actually also at the city level. It needs to be checked a bit. What about the exact data sources, which may be a bit different between the levels, but the background and the ideas behind it should be very well translatable.
Thank you. I think this was fascinating, and we actually have a question related to this topic more broadly. So in the EU, there really is a need for a more integrated policy approach regarding climate, biodiversity, and circular economy. So what could we do to strengthen these connections? And I would invite any of the coordination group members to answer the question. Please raise your hand so we will be able to give you the floor. So the question was, how can we strengthen connections between climate, biodiversity, and circular economy within the EU policy making? Do we have anyone from the coordination group willing to take the question?
Hello, Emma. It's Jennifer jumping in again. Just to remind all those following along that you need to put your questions into the chat. That way, Emma will be able to select them and put them to our speakers. So use the chat function, and if it's for a specific person as we go through the panel, please say who your question is directed at.
Okay. If any CG member still wants to answer, go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, I will ask this next question from the chat for Luke. This is for you. So, is the group of scientists planning on keeping working on the direct links between material footprint and circular economy strategies and carbon effects? The question asker says that if I understood correctly, this still isn't possible outside scenario modeling.
Well, what we will do is further focusing on making the links between the way in which we deal with materials and which environmental impacts it will have. But for the moment, I think developing these scenarios case by case is the best approach possible. I'm not aware of any more theoretical modelings that are able to make this more direct causal links between this. But in our research center, it's like an automatism that we never see circular economy alone. We always have to see it against the broader environmental impacts.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is super important. Also something what companies are calling for, looking at these synergies, as well as it would be really important for policymakers to see these synergies. Do we have any coordination group member wanting to answer the question about how in the EU we could strengthen these synergies in policies? Please raise your hand.
Hi, Emma. This is Lisa, and I had some technical problems, so it's sound without an image, unfortunately. But I'm working for OVAM, who's hosting the circular Flanders, where Luc already talked about what they did for us from this academic point of view on the monitor. And I would like to answer with a few elements on your question. First of all, maybe zooming a little bit out on the link climate circular economy. There, I wanted just to raise the point that so far we see that the architecture of climate policy is really focused on energy policy, and especially on the use phase of energy and the emissions that go along with that. And not taking into account the whole life cycle of products and the emissions embedded along that life cycle. So we think to make a bigger connection, a better connection, knowing that a bigger part or a big part of our emissions are due to the way we use their materials, we really think also that we need to reshape the architecture in terms of the climate models, the metrics, but even also thinking in terms of what targets are we setting for ourselves. And in implementing the CEAP, the Circular Economy Action Plan, we know that the Commission is already starting this reflection, and it's necessary also because it also might help us to at least bring clearly into the picture what might be trade-offs also between, for instance, the energy transition and resource use. Think of materials needed for renewable energy. Maybe moving a little bit further on where our opportunities at EU level in terms of connecting all those different elements, all those cross-cutting themes, we can see clearly that using the product environmental footprint tool, which will be at a product level, but which will enable us as well to really bring into the picture impacts of those products on climate at least, but also on elements of biodiversity. We think it's a very good way forward. We need to do that. We need to implement it in our eco-design, in our greening of claims, the green claims on the labeling. A pitfall there can be that we need also to really keep a good close look on the systems where those products are embedded in. Also, those systems need to take into account impacts on climate and biodiversity. So that's my first contribution.
Yeah, that was great, Lisa. Thank you for jumping in. And now, since you talked about the trade-offs and looking at climate and biodiversity together, we will jump onto our biodiversity side of this discussion. So next, we will have a closer look at the opportunities circular economy can have in halting biodiversity loss. Our next keynote will come from Alberto Ario Snell, who is responsible for policy and programs at the European Regional Office of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. He has held leading positions on EU environmental policy for the past 15 years. His current focus is working together with the key sectors related to biodiversity and nature, aiming to find ways to achieve the environmental targets jointly and to ensure ownership of these targets by all stakeholders. The floor is yours, Alberto.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you everybody for being here today. And also thank you very much for having biodiversity in the agenda. Biodiversity is now as important as climate. It's not that it's now, it has always been, but now it is recognized as such. So we find it in the policy discussion all the time, which is very welcome. This morning, or yesterday actually, Executive Vice President Timmermans was mentioning the biodiversity and climate crisis all the time together. Apart from the war in Ukraine anyway, and of course still the pandemic, we have a lot of crises to solve. But when it comes to the environment, now biodiversity and climate, is good to take them into account together. We need to find solutions and linkages and synergies between them because we need to solve both. In a way, I'm a little bit the biodiversity spokesperson here, as I work for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, as I said before. But I need to highlight very much that there are a number of members of the coordination group of the Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform, in particular INEC, CITRA, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and ourselves in the IUCN, that we are working together to link up biodiversity and the circular economy. There are actually some colleagues, as Emma has said before, that are available also for questions, and I'm sure they will be happy to later on contribute. So as I said, I'm really happy to discuss about biodiversity in this context with everybody, because this is the only way we are going to solve this crisis, all together, all of us, all sectors. By the way, similarly as for climate. Finally, biodiversity is a priority, as I mentioned, and it's at the same level as climate. And it's not just because we like animals or plants because they are lovely. No, this is very fundamental for us. This is about food, about clean air, about clean water, but it's also about protection, our protection against flooding, against soil erosion. It's also helping us to have construction materials, clothes, and it's also related with our health, with recreation, with well-being, and it's very much interrelated with climate anyway, because climate causes the loss of species, yes, but also because the destruction of ecosystems, such as forests, enhances climate change. And the biodiversity challenge is enormous. I think we are all aware, but it's not bad to remind some of the issues. The trends are very negative for all life on Earth. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which is assessing over 110,000 species, has found out that a third of these species are threatened with extinction. And we have already transformed over 70% of all land surface, and we are using about 3/4 of the freshwater resources. So land use change continues to destroy natural landscape. This is a very serious crisis. As I said, I'm very glad that biodiversity is a priority at the moment. 2020 was set out to be the year for biodiversity. That happened 2 years ago, and the pandemic was delaying a number of decisions. Only the EU biodiversity strategy as part of the Green Deal was approved that year. But we are still looking ahead to have the global biodiversity framework approved later on this year. And in this context, circular economy can be a fantastic tool to tackle the key drivers of biodiversity loss by changing the way we produce, we manage, we consume products and materials. The circular economy can offer a solution to the current problem of overexploitation of natural resources, and of course, the role that this has in the biodiversity crisis. So to look into this more in detail, and during the past 1.5 years, more or less, there has been a very important effort to see how circular economy can actually contribute to the biodiversity crisis. 4 members of the coordination group of a stakeholder platform, the Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform Coordination Group, INEC, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, CITRA, and IUCN, as I mentioned, has been collaborating, exploring interlinkages between the 2 fields and these 2 policy areas, where they have potential to be further strengthened. So 4 interrelated reports have been already produced. Well, 2 of them have been already produced, and 2 will be very soon published, examining how the circular economy and biodiversity can find synergies, each of them from slightly different angles. Let us remember, and this was mentioned also before by the previous speaker, we will need a transformative change. We need to transform our production and consumption systems. This is where the circular economy can help. In this context, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, in its very recent report that you can already find online, proposes 3 principles that can tackle the root causes of biodiversity loss. First one, eliminating waste and pollution to reduce the threats to biodiversity. Second one, to circulate products and materials, or circulating products and materials to leave room for biodiversity. And the last one, regenerating nature to enable biodiversity to thrive. The circular economy can help us in the fight against biodiversity loss, as said, if nature is at the heart of it, of course, as outlined by the INEC report, also very recent, also possible to find online already. The protection of biodiversity and natural ecosystems is sometimes a missing link in the circular economy. And in this context, it is fundamental to consider the whole sector, the whole systems. We need a systematic transformation, as we know. A good example here is the food and agriculture discussion. When we speak about food, it's useful to discuss about the food waste, which is a very important issue, but by itself, it will not solve the biodiversity loss crisis. We need to consider also how our food is being produced. So we need to ensure that agriculture is sustainable. And it includes also where it is produced, to ensure that the areas where this is produced are not really harmed. Also, it's important to check what kind of food is being produced. There are different impacts of different kinds of foods. So as I said, this is a whole systems approach. And I mentioned now the food example, which is an important one. It is clear we need to focus on some priority sectors. The most concerned with land use and resource extraction are the ones that are fundamental. And there are also the ones that have the greatest potential for transformation. And here I want to mention CITRA's upcoming study that will help to quantify the potential of some key sectors, including food and agriculture, as I already mentioned, but also forest, buildings and construction, and textiles and fibers. All these sectors are fundamental for biodiversity, and circular economy can help in the transformative change that we need, provided that biodiversity is at the heart of their action, as I already mentioned. But for this to happen, we need to ensure that the policy frameworks really consider biodiversity properly. So in the IUCN upcoming report, the last report that is in the list that I have been mentioning, the EU policy frameworks are being examined. We know we have the European Green Deal. It has been a very important step in the right direction to include both areas under one umbrella, the Green Deal. It is positive to note actually some elements of coordination already. For example, the EU biodiversity strategy links to the regulation on land use change and forestry, LULUCF, also links with the Renewable Energy Directive. The Circular Economy Action Plan includes a focus on bio-based materials, but maybe the linkages to other key areas and related policy areas, such as the common agricultural policies, could be more prominent. So further policy integration is possible and desirable. Such an integration actually between different issues is also important at international level, by the way. The current global biodiversity framework, the draft that is being discussed now, does not mention the term circular economy, something that we hope that will be different in the final approved version, of course. And again, focusing on integration and starting to get also to the end of my short speech, this is also about integrating climate and biodiversity. We are in this session focusing on these two issues, these two key environmental issues for both areas. There are some tools that can help to integrate the two areas. Nature-based solutions, I'm sure you have heard about them. By the way, it's an IUCN term, very popular nowadays, and there is a standard of IUCN about how this can be implemented. There are also other tools, such as the natural capital accounting, to ensure that we really integrate the value of nature in economic decisions. And by the way, we're also looking forward to seeing it happening in the European context. There are some promising developments. So to conclude, thank you to the Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform, but also to the European Commission and to the European Union in general for the leadership we are showing in terms of biodiversity and circular economy. Now we need to show that this can work in the implementation and in showing how they can be related. And we need to ensure that our actions help also going beyond Europe. As I mentioned, very soon we will have the Global Biodiversity Framework, and we hope we will have circular economy better reflected there. So just with our last words about the Ukraine, which is always difficult to forget, but we are here to make a better world, and this is what we can do through our working environment. I would like to, on behalf of IUCN, EMF, CITRA, and INEC, thank you very much. We are very happy to be part of this process.
Thank you, Albert. Such an inspiring speech once again. I would like to open the discussion now. Please pose your questions in the chat. And while we are waiting for more questions, I will start with this one. How can we ensure that ambitious biodiversity and circular economy policies stand the test of time, remaining relevant and just for future generations? Coordination group members, please raise your hand so we can give you the floor to speak.
Yes, thank you very much. Looking forward also for the answers from our colleagues from CITRA and from EMF and from INEC. But in any case, just to come back to this question, it is probably the key issue here. And actually, I want to relate this also with climate. We have a Paris moment some years ago, and we have some still developments on the climate front. We have less developments on the biodiversity front, and we hope that there will be some upcoming this year, as I said. I think that from the European side, we have a good number of pieces of legislation that are very, very useful. Probably the key challenge here is the implementation. And here I want to highlight the need for integration that I mentioned during my short speech. It is very important that all the different elements connecting the dots of different priorities are working together.
Thank you, Alberto. If any of the other coordination group members want to jump in, feel free to still raise your hand and answer this question as well. But we have another question that I will pose in the meantime as well. The question goes, what role do standards for nature-positive products and practices play in mainstreaming circular economy as a biodiversity solution? On what initiatives can we build on?
Please press the speak button. Mrs. Weber, press the speak button, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry for the technical issues. Yes, as you said, Alberto, as the environmental issue is like at the heart of the definition of circular economy, we have to try to more implement this circular economy and the environment that often takes second place to economic objectives. And I can Luc mentioned before that the carbon footprint is a link between circular economy and climate and biodiversity issues, but it's a part of the indicators, and it's not taking into account resources and other environmental aspects. Yet the Circular Economy Action Plan mentions that half of total greenhouse gas emissions and more than 90% of biodiversity loss on water stress result from resource extraction and processing. So those topics are really linked, but we have to find some indicators based on some critical resources, on climate, and not only on the carbon indicator. That is a good indicator, but it's a part of the solution. And maybe I can mention that in France we have a circular economy roadmap, a national roadmap, and the world biodiversity does not appear one time in this 60 pages national roadmap or in the French circular economy law, because the environment is a vague term and it encompasses different notions like climate change, biodiversity, natural resource depletion, land artificialization. But we have to address the link because take into account only circular economy circular economy is not most of the time the solution for biodiversity if biodiversity and climate are not taken into account into the conception of the strategy. So I want to thank the European Commission too to take into account this dimension in the new Green Deal and to think about all these interconnected notions in the conception of all those different strategies. We talked about the farm to fork strategy, about the biodiversity strategy, or the circular economy action plan.
Thank you, Marlene. I think that was a really great answer also to the question we posed earlier on how to integrate these interlinked issues in EU policymaking. So thank you for making the connection to that question earlier. I think we have a question coming in from the youth. Please, can we give the floor to the youth? No, I guess we are running out of time. We have one quick question with a really short answer if one of the coordination group members wants to answer, a question on human population growth. And the question goes, to what extent has human population growth been considered in the work of circular economy and biodiversity? Can a transition to a circular economy make up for the increased need for primary resources and the impacts of their extraction on biodiversity? Really short answer. Does someone want to take the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. I will just be very short. Well, when it comes to environmental challenges, there are two key issues. One is population growth and the other one is consumption. And probably these two issues, or especially the consumption one, is the one that is tackled by the circular economy. So anything we can do in the direction of reducing consumption, which is going to be not easy, is going to be very helpful. The circular economy is probably one of the key tools in this direction. For population, it's a fundamental issue, but it's something that maybe goes beyond the policies that are related with environment, of course.
Thank you, Alberto, for the really precise and quick answer. And now we are running out of time, and I shall wrap up this interesting session. First, I would like to thank all of our speakers and the audience for posing interesting questions. And to close up, I would like to still do a little recap of what we have been talking about. So we have heard an inspiring example of a monitor being developed in Flanders and have reflected on the possibilities of addressing biodiversity loss using circular economy. It is really clear for me that without changing the way we produce, manage, and process materials, we will be unable to tackle the root causes of the planetary crisis. For best results, our experts also called out that we need systemic solutions that look at biodiversity, climate, and circularity simultaneously. We also heard from Alberto that we are just going into the negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it is crucial that there we also address the root causes of biodiversity loss by building the framework to tackle unsustainable consumption and production. And finally, I would like to remind us that we are also facing social crisis at the moment that is amplified by the planetary crisis. So at this time point, I think it's really important that we continue our work and strengthen our messages for a brighter future. Thank you.